Hey everyone, thanks for joining the Cost of Ransomware webinar today, brought to you by Cyopsis. My name is Trey Amick. I'm the host. I'm one of the forensic consultant managers here at Magna Forensics, and today I have Craig Bernard, who is the president and co-founder of Cyopsis. We also have Mary and John, both who are joining us, that will be answering questions throughout the presentation. If for whatever reason we don't get to your question, we'll definitely follow up after the presentation. But that being said, please submit questions in the GoToWebinar question box, and we'll either answer them live or send private messages back to you on that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Craig, Mary, and John. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining today. I know everybody's got busy schedules, so I appreciate your time. As he said, my name is Craig Bernard. We founded a company called Cyopsis back in 2009. So we're starting our 12th year of business, 11th year of business, pardon me. And we're primarily based out of Denver, Colorado. That's where we started, but we now have staff that goes coast to coast. We work primarily in the United States. We do digital forensics, e-discovery, and human investigative work. So we've kind of got a variety of backgrounds in the company. And so my background, and we'll just go over this real quick because we're not trying to sell the company here, but just so you understand, my background primarily finance and accounting, but in my role here over the last 11 years with Cyopsis, I am a qualified expert in the United States to testify on computer forensics, and have done so on many occasions. And so that's kind of my high-level background. The company itself, just so you understand what we do, so digital forensics, anything for criminal or civil litigations that have to do with digital evidence. So it could be emails, it could be servers, computers, system logs. We also do digital media and cell phone analysis. I won't ever make the statement we do everything, because that would be overreaching. But we haven't touched a lot of things, and it's anywhere from state and local municipalities up to federal courts and other investigative agencies, like here in the U.S., the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC type things. So that high level on me, high level on the company, and I'm going to let John Goldberg introduce himself.
Hello, I'm John Goldberg. I'm the CTO of Cyopsis. My background is internet startups in Silicon Valley. I've worked with people like Eric Swan, who founded Splunk. I do mainly breach investigations and ransomware, and I actually wrote a lot of the OpenSSL library back in 1998, so pretty familiar with encryption. And we spend a lot of our time trying to recover data for customers and figuring out how the breach occurred so we can close those doors. And with that, I will turn it down to Marisol.
Hello, my name is Marisol Torres. Everybody calls me Mary. My background is in forensics. I'm a trained forensic anthropologist who then segued into digital forensics. I have my master's from George Washington, and in the last, George Washington University, and in the last 3 years, I have worked heavily ransomware cases, and we're talking from negotiation with attackers all the way through to the forensic analysis and final reporting. And that's what I do, or that's what I did. Here, I'm a digital analyst, and I do litigation cases, but still heavily do ransomware when possible.
All right, thank you both. And with that, we'll get on with the presentation. And just so you understand, this presentation isn't necessarily getting into the nuts and bolts of how ransomware works, and how to decode and those kind of things. This is really, it was designed for our clients, who are primarily attorneys, working with them so they understand here's a lot of the aspects you need to be concerned with based on our experience, and then actually doing these presentations for their clients, so to help them be better prepared just because of the rise in ransomware. And with that, we'll kind of move on here. All right. So first slide we have here is really talking about different types of malicious encryption software and just some of the popular ones. There's no way we could cover them all in here because anybody with the skills can actually create ransomware. So on the left-hand side here, you kind of see some of the names, WannaCry, Grain Crab, or R-Evil, Maze, and I'm not even going to attempt the bottom line ones there. And on the right, it just kind of shows how how frequently they are. But to talk about ransomware and what it does is, again, at a high level, somehow software gets into a company. It's usually, whether it's software, somebody plugs in a USB drive, they click on a malicious link from the web or from email. Somehow it gets down into the system and the program gets executed. And then what it does is it encrypts everything that's on the computer. And it does it on a file by file basis. So as a user, when you come in the next morning and you have this message up on your computer that everything's been encrypted, you can go in and look and see here's all the files, but each one of them typically has the extension changed. And simply changing the extension from your Word document from .doc from XYZ PDQ that the bad guys had replaced it with, it won't fix the issue. And the reason that is because the file's actually encrypted. And I think most of you are probably knowledgeable about encryption, but just in case, it's actually designed to help protect your data. So whether it be on your computers, your servers, data in transit, what it does is it encapsulates it, and in order to access it, you need what's called a key. And those keys are they're randomly generated, or they're generated by whoever, in this case, whoever created the ransomware. And you typically cannot decrypt these. There are some people have tools out there that they can run them against files to see if they can actually decrypt them. Could take days, it could take weeks or months, or never, depending on how complex that key is. So again, that's kind of the high level of what these guys do. They come in, the bad actors, they come in, run the program, and encrypt your data so you can't access it. And then they leave a message on your machine, and that message typically tells us which one of these strains, WannaCry, Grand Crab, for instance, that actually was used to encrypt your data. And then having to look at some of those ransom messages that are on there, you might also be able to tell what's called a variant. Okay, so what happens is somebody will develop a software, a bad actor does. They may deploy it themselves, and if they do, it's going to be, let's say it's WannaCry, and that's the organization, whoever the organization is, they've now developed the software and they have their specific message they put in their ransomware. Well, somebody can actually buy from WannaCry, can actually buy a copy of this program and make some modifications to it if they want. And so that's a variant of WannaCry. And that's what kind of adds some of the complexity into when we start dealing with the decryption process. So that's really kind of the high level of what decryption software is, and now some of the implications of it. So you get a client or yourself that actually gets hit, and you need to do something. And when we say it's on the clock, there's multiple reasons why you're on the clock to actually take action. So first of all, one of them's ransom expiration. depending on whoever had installed it, they may put in their message, you need to contact us within 10 days. If you don't, the ransom is doubled. Or they may put in the ransom note that if you don't contact us in 10 days, that your data is going to be lost forever and you won't be able to recover it. So there's a clock that's ticking on that piece of it. Reporting requirements. So depending on your client's business, they may have different reporting requirements. And I know we have some folks that are not from the US, but I'll have to talk to what I know. So within the United States, we have different requirements by different states on whether you report personally identifiable information, or PII. So like a name, a date of birth, an address are such items. Personal health information, or PHI, or payment card information, PCI, or if they have Department of Defense requirements. And there's other ones, but those are typically the ones we end up running into. And each one of those have reporting requirements that you need to understand as to, you have to get data decoded and understand what may or may not have been exfiltrated. The other one here is open doors. So, and what we're referring to there is the bad guys still may have access. Let's say the entire network has not been encrypted. And so the bad actors may still have access to your network or to devices on there. And as an example of that, we had a utility company we worked with. They got hit once with ransomware on a couple of devices. Fortunately, it didn't get spread completely across the network. And within a couple months, had the same thing happen again because they didn't close the door on how the bad actors got in. The third thing is, probably the last item here, the fourth item is regarding evidence preservation. For the forensic folks out there, you're well aware of this. Logs get overwritten, items drop off. For the non-forensic folks, what I'm talking about specifically is we're talking about network logs. So it tracks who comes into your environment. And those logs may, depending on how the settings are set up, may be 14 days, it may be 30 days, it may be 60 days. But let's say if it's 30 days, items drop off. So it's a rolling 30 days. The bad actors may have gotten lucky and gotten into the system immediately, or they may have actually gained access and 30, 60 days before planned out what they wanted to exfiltrated data, and then they executed their ransomware program. So it's very important with evidence preservation is to start preserving as soon as possible so you don't potentially lose key data. The next thing I'm going to talk about is involving third parties. It's a very tough situation when we talk to our clients. They know they've been hit with ransomware. They know it's going to cost them money, and they really do not want to spend any more than what they have to. So we have to have these conversations with them of, this is when you look at your team, if you have a ransomware breach, these are the type of folks and reasons why you want to involve third parties. So, the first one on the list here is the forensic team. And you want to make sure it's not just any computer forensic folks. You want to make sure it's forensics folks who have experience with breaches and specifically with ransom breaches. And there's really reasons for that, is because when you start decrypting and understanding how the ransomware works, you need somebody who's experienced with that, because it is a unique beast. And it's really hard to explain until you've been involved with a few of them, and then you start understanding why, pardon me, why you need somebody experienced. And when you get in the, pardon me, sip of water there. When you get an experienced team, they'll know where to go look, to look for evidence. They'll know what to preserve. Because when we, for instance, here recently in Colorado, a few months ago, a tech company was breached, and they actually supported several hundred dentist offices around Metro Denver area. And they then gained access to all of these dentist offices and encrypted everything. It was not good. They requested $8 million from the group of individuals. But my point being, when we went into one of the clients here and we did our evaluation, they had several computers that were in where the dentist actually and the dental hygienist worked on the patients. And all it was a computer. It was a Windows-based computer that had access into the server where all the medical records and everything was tracked. All those machines were encrypted. Well, we didn't need to preserve those, for instance, because there's no data on them. And what we ended up doing is just taking those devices out of service, pulling the hard drives. So now we have they did need to be imaged, but we preserved them by removing the hard drives because we were able to do that with that kind of device. Some devices you can't remove the hard drives, but in this case, it actually worked well for the client. So it actually gave them much better peace of mind, and it saved them hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. Independence is another key factor here, and the reason that is when you're doing the investigation, a phrase here we use is you can't grade your own homework. So if you're in class and you took a quiz, don't grade your own homework because you're going to be biased. And an example of that, we're currently working a breach with a client who used a web developer, and they also hosted the website. And so our client called us in to assist with the breach because they didn't think something sounded right. The developer and host stated in their investigation that it was an add-in that they put in, that was purchased to put in our client's website, that had a flaw in it, and it's been there for a few years. But the breach only occurred, let's say, back in January. But when we went back and looked at and did our investigation, well, the website developer ended up changing their code and potentially introduced a vulnerability in, I'm sure I used the wrong term, John, but they introduced a hole that the bad guys could get into, and actually that's what we feel created the breach. So the person who did that investigation wasn't independent because they're the ones who actually caused it. And that's the same thing is true when you look at so big organizations. We get involved because if we need to talk to law enforcement or any governing bodies, let's say for personal health information going away, we will end up writing reports as an independent investigator, and that actually has more weight than an internal report, because an internal report, they don't want to look bad. There may be liability from an internal report. Privilege. Not sure, again, how this translates outside the U.S., but within the U.S., we typically engage lawyers, barristers, attorneys, and the reason we do that is because we then fall under attorney-client privilege, and our investigations fall under that attorney-client privilege. So that actually allows us to do a very thorough investigation and helps protect our clients in our findings. Now, there's some recent, and I will say this, I'm not an attorney, but I know there's some recent litigation out there that starts trying to poke holes in the methodology for that, where you can do investigations and have them covered 100% under attorney-client privilege. but that's something to discuss with the attorneys when you get them in. The other good reason to get attorneys involved is they're the ones who are going to understand from the clock ticking slide the type of data and the reporting obligations that our clients have. They'll be familiar with the local, the state and federal regulations and how many days you actually have to report. That is something as a forensic company we do not track. We know we have some good ideas, but we don't keep up on the laws to that level, and we will not advise our clients aside from you need to talk to the attorney. Another reason to get a third party involved is staff bandwidth. Typically, when you run into a situation like this, the staff is typically they're overwhelmed with dealing with their clients and talking to their clients and trying to maintain them so that when everything comes back up online, they can actually run the business. The owners are typically dealing with insurance companies, attorneys, trying to find money, so banks, et cetera, and they don't have time to work through the investigation, to work through getting the data decrypted. Looking at the cost to the company, and I noticed I had a typo there, it's cost to the company, is if you try and do all this stuff internally, you really, unless you're unique, you don't have the experienced staff to deal with decrypting the software, doing the forensic preservations, doing the investigations. It's not that they don't have people who are not capable, they just don't necessarily have that experience. And so the longer the client's data is encrypted, their environment shut down, they start losing money every single day due to lack of revenue. Law enforcement, depending on, in other regulatory agencies, I'll toss in there, depending on what data you lost, you will have reporting obligations to law enforcement or regulatory agencies, like potentially, let's say, the Department of Defense, if they have weapons or protected, it's called ITAR here in the US, if you have those type of items that may have been breached. But the other thing is we deal with the FBI on a regular basis with these type of cases. We'll get the data together, we'll do our preservations of the encrypted and decrypted devices. They'll typically want some copies of those, of the forensic images, and they'll also want to talk to us and look at our report so we can kind of discuss what occurred, because the FBI does track ransomware events. Depending on how big they are, I don't want to say this badly. The FBI will get involved, and due to and the level of their involvement will depend on how much money and the type of data that has been breached. Professional negotiators. Typically, this one gets overlooked. It's actually a very big deal, and I'm not purporting to use some folks, but one that we have used is called Coveware in the past. And the reason we ended up working with Coveware is they're very, very familiar with the strains. What they do, just so you know, they will negotiate with the bad guys, so they know who they are, and they contact them from that ransom message that was left on the computer. So you provide that to them, then they start the negotiations with them. For instance, this $8 million dental office that happened here in Colorado. Well, since there was over 200 different offices that were hit, they started negotiating individually, because initially they said $8 million, you all need to pool your money together and give us $8 million bucks. Well, then the individuals started negotiating, and they typically charge a price per key. So if I had 10 computers that were encrypted, that's typically 10 decryption keys that you need to purchase. And they'll help negotiate the price, and they'll have a pretty good idea of how much you should be paying. and they have channels 24/7 to communicate with these folks. Another thing that for your professional negotiator is bad guys don't take a check. They don't take cash for obvious reasons. So typically they'll deal in cyber currency, typically in Bitcoin. And if you haven't established a Bitcoin account before, it is not a quick and easy process, especially when you're talking thousands of dollars. Here in the US, they actually put holds on accounts when you start putting deposits in them of over $10,000. So that getting the account set up, getting the money so you can actually transfer it could probably easily take over 2 weeks to get it to the point. And I've talked to folks, it's been 3 or 4 weeks to get it to the point where you actually have the money in the account and have the ability to transfer it to the bad actors to get the keys. Coveware has Bitcoin already established. They have lots of funds in there. And another thing that it helps with this particular negotiator is as a client, if I don't have a $20,000 sitting in my bank account, but you do have a credit card, you can do that over the phone, and they'll take your credit card, Coveware will, and charge your credit card, and off you go. They will also, once they receive the keys back from the bad actors, they'll actually test them to make sure that it works. And if it doesn't work, they'll work with the bad actors until they get a resolution on a good key. And then once they do that, and what they test it on is you have to provide them a couple files, and they will test, Coveware will test that on the files. So they're very essential, and again, they charge money, but they are very essential in a quick turnaround time. And then the last one is if there was actually a breach that had occurred or data exfiltration and it's a reportable incident, typically you'll want to get some sort of public relations team together. I'm not sure what that looks like, but there's actually firms out here or working with the attorneys. They can get you in touch with somebody. And that's notifying somebody that your name and social security or personal health information has been compromised or potentially compromised, and they'll usually offer some sort of credit monitoring service so that if somebody starts setting up, let's say, loans or fake credit cards in your name, you get notified and you have insurance through these credit monitoring companies. So on to the next slide here, and a quick drink. So as we talk through this, as you're aware, there's a lot of things that are happening, and the clock is ticking. So what we have coined as simultaneous multi-pronged project approach. So we do several things, and we try and we'll launch them all at once because almost everything in here is time critical. So the first one that I've talked about already was the evidence preservation. And it's again a critical first step, because knowing how they got in, if they're still into your system, and starting that analysis immediately is extremely important, so there's no spoliation of data. And the other thing that you'll want to do is after items are decrypted, you'll want to go back in and you might do it all of the devices, but start targeting devices you want to preserve or re-image and do analysis on to see if you can find other traces of how they got in or what data that they took. So preservation is one that we kick off immediately. A lot of cases it can be done remotely. Sometimes it can't. It really depends on the situation. As a good forensic person would always say, it depends. The next item on this is the security incident identification. And we really need to understand what type of incident was it. So security incident is not necessarily a breach. So a breach is a type of a security incident, but a security incident is not necessarily a breach. So if you get like a malware infection, if somebody does a DDoS attack, distributed denial of service attack, somehow there was unauthorized access, somebody lost equipment. Those are types of security incidents. Those aren't necessarily reportable. You need to then figure out, was there a breach, and was there data that's reportable that has been accessed? And that starts that other clock ticking on your reporting requirements with the local agencies or whoever the regulatory body is that you have. And again, that those timelines depend, they're different per state and federal statutes. The other thing you want to try and figure out is, okay, so we had an incident, what was it? Because when we get back up and running, we don't want it to occur again. And so it's very important to start that investigation with somebody who's very familiar with network breaches, and because that's typically how it comes in, or email breaches. The other thing we try and find out in this is how and when it occurred. So did the bad guys get in, months ago, or was it dumb luck and somebody clicked on a link, the program came down, and the next night everything got encrypted? That's very important to know, because if it was the click and off you go and it's encrypted immediately, there's less risk of other data being accessed. So it might not have been a data exfiltration. And the other piece is looking at what sources or devices were encrypted. So that's part of the security incident look. One of the other things we do is interviewing the client regarding their policies, which are paper, their procedures, which are paper, and then the actual practices. And we look at how those relate to how do we prevent the security incident? How are they protecting their clients' data? And the reason, there's a couple reasons those are extremely important, is we're there to help protect our client. So we want to make sure if we can, we document so we reduce the risk of liability to our client, and also helps with client retention. So if our client is using industry best practices to encrypt data at rest and in transit, and they have their firewalls are up to date, et cetera, and they have all different things in place, that's good for them. That's a good story. Bad guys, it's if you haven't been hacked, you will be, is the mantra here. But that helps tell the story for our clients. Another thing that it'll help with is if they have cyber insurance, which is becoming more and more common. It's been out there for a long time now, but more and more people are picking it up, and it's not necessarily expensive. Was talking with a client here last week, and for I think it was $5 million, it cost them $5,000 a year. So if you have cyber insurance, they're going to make sure that you actually took precautions to protect the data, so that they will then reimburse you for the investigation, for your attorney fees, for your forensic fees, for loss of business, and and also with the client retention piece of that. Another good thing, if they have done, is you're going through your inventory. It's called data classification. Hopefully, they have segregated their networks so that protected information, whether it be health information or personal information, they're in different segments. They classified them, they know what they are, and they put them in different segments of the network. So that'll also help our investigation in knowing where we need to go look to see if things have been accessed. And then as far as practices, some of the common ones are that they can put in to help control things, and I'll cover this here, but also again in the past, do they have two-factor authentication? Do they do penetration testing? Their third-party vendors, do they do validation and how they protect their data? For instance, the IT security or the IT support company a third party could have come in and validated them to make sure that the access they were using didn't allow 300 clients or over 200 clients to get infected by the same attack. Looking at your backup policies. I already mentioned network segmentation and data encryption and best practice analysis. And there may be some compliance that's mandatory with different report, depending on the data and the different regulatory agencies. The next slide here is talking about remediation. So I already kind of have been on this a couple different times, so I won't spend long, but you got to figure out what caused the security incident. And so as that's identified above, you have to start plugging those holes. And you'll look for obvious paths as to how they got in there. So you look for those in network logs, actual emails or email logs. And when you can actually get to the devices, looking at Windows event logs, browser activity, different things there. So understanding how they get in so you can remediate that hole. Next one on here is the restoration of service. As I mentioned earlier, this is when I talk to a client, get me up, get me working, I'm losing money. How can I pay for everything if I don't have money coming in? So when we start looking at restoration of service, you really want to understand what was the scope of the encryption. So was it your development file server, which could be key, but it may not be key, and you just say I don't need or essential. It could be an essential piece of equipment. Or those dumb terminals in the office from the dentist office, those aren't necessarily mission critical either. But the file server that has all their patient records on it, that's mission critical. So really going through and understanding that. And as you're doing that, understanding the scope of encryption will also help you understand how many of the decryption keys need to be negotiated with for the bad guys. And so, for instance, there was, I believe the number was 7 that we didn't, for this dentist office, that we didn't need to purchase. So the client didn't have to spend the money on them because there was nothing on those machines. And then there was another, I think there was a receptionist machine where there was forms and those kind of things on it, but it wasn't worth spending a couple $1,000s for that decryption key for that computer. So understanding what was encrypted, what's mission critical, that way you can save the client money. It's also less time in decryption. And then, as I mentioned already, getting that third party, like with Coveware, they have this process down. They are very expedient in the negotiations, the transfer of funds, the testing, and can help you getting back up and running. For instance, when we worked with them for this dentist office, I think from the time we got them involved until the time we got the decryption key was 3 days. And I know other clients who tried to do it with themselves. They were at week 3 and they still hadn't gotten to the point where they could transfer the money. So again, very important. The other thing when we're looking at restoration of service is understanding what needs to be restored. As I talked about let's say our patient information on a file server, well, do we need to decrypt the server, or do we have a good backup that didn't get encrypted? And there are, you can do backups, that's great, but if you leave them hooked up into your environment and accessible from the servers, there's a good chance that those things will get encrypted because they're visible on the network. So figuring out how to hide your backups for business continuity, whether it be hiding them physically on the network or virtually on the network, I should say, or using a cloud-based system. because the way this encryption software works, it won't go to the cloud to encrypt your backups out there. If you have Microsoft Office 365 for your email, instead of a locally based email exchange server, it can't touch that cloud. So that's important to know. The other thing is to understand the time frame for restoration. So let's say we do find a backup and it's terabytes, 20, 30 terabytes, to get that restored, and that's going to take 2 to 3 weeks versus paying $5,000 for a decryption key. That then becomes a business decision. So those are other factors that you want to take into consideration. The other thing is, this is where you need to get the legal team involved, right? So the notifications, the legal requirements. If a client calls us, our first question is, are you represented by counsel? If not, here's some options that we have. And we tell them you really need to get an attorney involved immediately. And so as we get these discussions going, again, the attorneys will look at whether it's PHI, PII, PCI, or any of the Department of Defense type things. And then they are waiting from our investigator to tell them, well, did exfiltration, did it happen? Did it not happen? Or can we not tell? And then we provide those opinions to the attorneys, and then the attorneys make the call on whether it's a reportable incident or not. And so that's part of what we do. So this is kind of the wrap up. We've kind of painted a picture of the events that can occur and how they're on the rise. More and more people are getting hit. So as we say here's planning for the next critical incident. Okay, so TikTok, realize that these things are urgent, and more businesses are getting hit with these types of attacks. So as you're talking to your clients, some of the things they need to be aware of, right, is some of these policies and procedures that I mentioned before. 2-factor authentication, training of your employees. Don't click on certain links. We see them, I'm sure everybody sees them in their email every day. Doesn't look right. Shouldn't be clicking on these. Understanding that you need to play out some different scenarios. So looking at the restoration. If you do get hit, how can we restore? How do we make sure we have good backups? And if that fails, what's our plan B? So it's actually playing out some scenarios here. Business continuity planning, if some folks have done this. Something else that you do, so once you come up with your plans, your policies and procedures, you also need to make sure that you test them. Typically you want to test things, depending on your business, at least on an annual basis. And some businesses may require even more frequent, depending on what data you're trying to protect. And as I mentioned earlier, if you've got backups configured, and they make sure you get them configured so they can't get touched by the malware, but you also need to test that restoration process to make sure that it works. Yes, it's a pain, but if you're going to count on this for, whether it be for a malware attack or loss of hardware, you need to make sure your backup processes and restoration processes are working. And so really one of the big calls to action that comes out of this presentation is understanding that you need to develop a critical incident response plan and have a critical incident response team that you have already identified and in place so that you can punch the button on your phone and call them. From a report that IBM had just done, the formation of a incident response team lowered the total cost of a data breach by, and I don't know if the numbers here, but this is what they quote, by an average of $360,000 and they're talking about when a breach costs, this is like a $4 million breach. So these are big breaches, but it actually showed that it lowered the cost. So that would include time to get back into service, and having the right team in place that's efficient and understands how it works, so there's less build time to the client. And so they go on to say extensive testing of the IR plan reduced the total cost of the breach by another $320,000. And so actually having the plan and then testing it on an annual basis to make sure that things were working the way they were supposed to showed additional savings. So those are the key things there. And this is our conclusions, and then we'll go over to the Q&A session if folks have some questions. But here's just some information that we'd found, right? So 4% on average, people click those phishing emails, like the crud that shows up in your email box. 50% of small businesses have been breached and somehow had an incident in the last 12 months. 4,000 attacks. This is the average daily since 2016. And 39% of these were malware cases. They were identified as some sort of malware. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Appreciate it, and would like to open it up to some questions.
Great, thank you, Craig. Your team, John and Mary, have been doing great with the questions. We can see. I'll throw it over to either one of y'all if y'all want to throw out any questions to Craig to kind of go over publicly. And if there's not, we can go ahead and we'll give it just a second. And if not, we'll go ahead and wrap up. If we haven't answered, we'll make sure to follow up.
One of the questions, one of the questions I see in here, is it better to take a full image or a triage image in ransomware attacks? Typically, we'll do the full disk image because it's not uncommon for the bad guys to have two different programs for the here's the breach. You click, let's say you click on an email, it downloads a program, which then is able to communicate back to the mothership. Sorry, back to the bad guys wherever their servers are. And then that program allows for the delivery of the ransomware back to that computer. And part of what they will do is actually go back and clean up that first program. So we do full disk images and end up carving to look for evidence of those items that may have actually been the actual first piece of what happened here.
Hey, Craig, this is John. We've gotten a number of questions of people asking, how do you find the encryption key to de-encrypt the ransomware? And that is the $100 question or the $1 million question, depending on how important the data is to you. There were a few people who asked about getting a memory dump. If you have a quick enough memory dump, sometimes you can find that key in the memory dump. We always take full disk images because sometimes the hackers are sloppy or you catch them midstream and you can find the files that were deleted using carving and something like Axiom. You can actually restore those files. There are also antidote tools that are available depending on the strain of ransomware that you get that may decrypt it. And there's new information about a strain every day. So there may not be an antidote today, but tomorrow there will be. So it's something where you always have to stay attached to. So just wanted to answer those questions because we got a lot of those.
Yeah, I greatly appreciate that, and I do apologize I didn't talk about a memory capture. So getting back to that very first important urgent thing with the forensic preservation is make sure your clients don't turn off their machines. If they're concerned about people still getting in, they can always just unplug the network cable, But as you mentioned, RAM analysis, there's a potential where you can get those keys in there. Mary, was there anything that jumped out at you that multiple folks were asking?
Not really. I do see that there's a lot of other questions coming in, so I don't know if there's a way for us to be able to answer those questions offline, especially any of the Spanish speakers on, to have, I guess, have a way for them to communicate with us in a way that obviously once the meeting is over, we can't do that anymore.
Yeah, we'll definitely follow up with questions after the fact so that y'all can follow up. I did see one other one come in as far as, what are more vulnerable as far as the Windows OS or Linux OS. I don't know if y'all want to kind of chime in on what y'all are seeing more of.
I would say Windows.
Yeah, I would say Windows too. Mac is becoming quite vulnerable. It actually had, for the last 2 months, more vulnerabilities. There's just less ransomware strains that run on Mac. And then Linux is way down on the list because it's far more hardened. But we have actually seen it on some Linux systems as well.
Correct.
Excellent. Well, with that, like you said, Mary, we'll definitely follow up with the rest of the questions that we weren't able to get to today, but we will follow up and kind of wrap up here. Thank you all for joining us today. Craig, that was a great presentation. I know I definitely learned a lot from the mitigation and working with legal teams and kind of that thought process that a lot of corporations really need to think about when it comes to mitigating ransomware and what all that entails. But with that, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day.
Yep, thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.